Hi, greetings everybody. I hope you're all well and safe. Welcome to another webinar with SPJIMR's Center for Financial Studies. I have the absolute pleasure and privilege to bring to you today Dr. Raghuram Rajan. He's going to be here with us for the next 1 hour. Dr. Rajan, thank you so much for making time for us for SPJIMR. I hope you're well, sir. Good morning to you.
Good morning. Good morning.
Great. Thank you so much for making the time again. For everybody on this call, I had approached Dr. Rajan long time back, and he remembered and he came back and said, I have the time for this particular day. Will you take it? So thank you, Dr. Rajan. You're a man of your word. What we've done, Dr. Rajan, is I'm going to be very rude. I'm not going to introduce you. We want to squeeze as much as we can from the 1 hour we have with you. A whole host of questions have come to us from students, alumni, from well-wishers, from stakeholders, faculty. We've got them in 3 or 4 categories. One pertains to global geopolitics. Second pertains to economics, global economics. And of course, a whole host of questions on India, our country, India. And finally, some closing questions. These are crowdsourced questions. So I'm going to start rapid fire, one after the other. And I'm going to start with an extremely unfair question. 13 days from now, Dr. Rajan, we have the US elections, both for the president and the Senate, 1/3 of the Senate. We also have the Brexit event in front of us, hanging a fire. What does the Dr. Rajan crystal ball tell us about what will be happening over the next couple of weeks? Completely unfair question to start with.
Well, I don't have a crystal ball. All I can do is look at some of the prediction markets, which many people express their opinions. I sort of look at the markets for the US every day. And clearly, Vice President Biden is leading by a large margin. And of course, all the polls which are attempting to correct for what they got wrong the last time seem to suggest again that he is in the lead. But of course, after the fact, after Brexit, which we didn't quite predict the vote on, and the Trump election in 2016, I think most people are sort of waiting to actually see that these things are verified by the actual event. So, at this point, I think Vice President Biden clearly has the edge. On Brexit, I mean, my sense is an actual Brexit without any, backup agreement, etc., will be immensely costly. So my sense is at this point, we're still seeing the last bits of play acting. And at some point, they'll sit down together and say, okay, this is what we need to do. And it'll be less effective than if they'd done it a long time back and made the preparations. But I'm still hopeful that you don't see a clean break so far, by the end of the year.
Fingers crossed, Dr. Rajan, and I hope for all of us, the sake of all of us, that it comes true. A larger question emanating from this, Dr. Rajan, geopolitics. This US, China, and now China versus almost everybody around China. Is it developing into a larger theme which will go on for the medium term? Are we already in the midst of a Cold War? And does it have an impact, therefore, on the global economy going forward?
I think the realization in both Beijing and Washington is that they hadn't, thought about the strategic relationship as much in the past. It was largely focused on the commercial relationship. Mm-hmm. And as a result, they hadn't prepared for the day that China would challenge the United States, both economically, but most importantly, on the military side. It was also not, I think, set for leaders with such sharp edges as Xi Jinping. I think Xi Jinping started the process by saying that China is ready to wake up and stand strong rather than keep quiet, as Deng Xiaoping had advocated. Yeah. And President Trump also has sharp corners. But these leaders are also reflecting the mood in their own countries. In China, of going past what it thinks of as the unfair treaties of 100 years ago, and the United States trying to maintain its preeminent position given the kind of post-war structure it created. So what we have is bilateral negotiations where each side has very little room to give and take. And as a result, we've got, this a little bit of an impasse. We now have an agreement between the two countries, but which isn't being followed up on, in the sense that China is certainly not buying what it promised. In the meantime, and as you correctly pointed, China is picking fights all along its borders with many of its neighbors. And that I find harder to understand. I mean, it seems like China is giving in to its wolf warriors, when in fact it makes sense to be a little quieter at this point, because you pick one fight at a time, you don't pick many fights. And I think post US election, it'll be interesting if there is a change in administration, there will be a possibility of a larger coalition of democracies coming together. And that may lead to better talks, more less chance that China will be able to pick and pick off entities and break up the coalition, but also more chance that they can come together and say, look, you have to respect the rules of the game. We can decide what those rules of the game are, but we have to have respect on both sides. And I do hope that we have a greater dialogue post election.
That sounds pretty hopeful, Dr. Rajan, but there are some who believe that irrespective of who comes out, even if it's Vice President Biden who comes through, this is deep-seated, and this will probably prolong, and it's a tension of two different systems trying to find a way out.
It certainly is. It certainly is. But there is a modus vivendi which doesn't require overt conflict, right? There are areas where there is absolute conflict between the two countries: intellectual property, the role of Chinese expats in the United States, the worry about in China about the US preventing China from exceeding a certain level of technological capability. I mean, there's a lot of suspicion on both sides. And I think what is possible is to keep some of the relationships which are non-controversial, for example, trade in basic goods and services, separate from the areas that are more prone to conflict, such as artificial intelligence, chip making, robotics, places like that. So can you sort of maintain a dual track, one where you're dealing with issues of common interest, which include issues like global warming, and a second track where you deal with conflictual issues where the strategic relationship between the two countries are at work? I think you're absolutely right. Regardless of whether it's Democrats or Republicans in Washington, they do fear a rising China, as much for the fact that the structure of the Chinese administration has changed over the last so many years under Xi Jinping, than just the rise of China itself. A more democratic China would be significantly more acceptable in the West, and so I think there is scope for discussion. But yes, it's not going to be kumbaya and embracing each other.
Absolutely. You mentioned leaders with sharp edges: Xi Jinping, Trump. There are a few more of them around the world, which brings me to the next question. Is moderate liberal democracy losing ground, and is the tide shifting towards populism and authoritarianism? Is that the next phase which is going to pass through?
It is losing ground for sure. The question is, are there ways that it will pick up again? And what is causing this across the board belief in strong men across the world? And they're usually men. There are very few women amongst the strong leaders. And I suspect that there are common forces. Certainly technological change has hit many countries. There's a fear of job loss. There's a fear of your protected status. I think that is coming, that is, in a sense, coming into collision with another fear, which is of, majority groups about this push for equality. Whether in the US it is from the African Americans and the Hispanics that we want equal status, and certainly the ideas of the time are supporting that, or whether it's in India from the Dalits and the minority communities, that we are certainly left behind. And then there's a majority reaction. And I suspect there are elements of this. I mean, these are complicated phenomena, so it's easy to reduce them to a few simple thoughts. But the fact that this is across the world, it's in Hungary, it's in the United States, it's in
Brazil,
Turkey. Yeah, you can go down the list. And so I suspect there's some of that. And then people look for a strong leader to protect them against these forces. And we certainly have many instances in history where that confidence has not been well repaid.
So the last question in this section, Dr. Rajan, and this involves you. Normally, when you have such complicated issues, we look to experts, people who are thoughtful, do research, to tell us the way forward and to explain to us what's really happening. Unfortunately, experts seem to have lost a lot of credibility as well. In fact, it's become almost fashionable to say experts, don't really understand what's happening on the ground. What is the way forward on this, and what's really happened? Have experts, who's to blame here? Is it experts themselves? Have they lost touch with what's happening on the ground?
I'm not sure it's certainly the quote unquote experts have some responsibility, right? In the sense that you need trust. And certainly experts, sometimes have been confused, deluded by their elite status, and have worked towards the interests of the elite group, which has made them easy prey for those who say, you guys are out of touch, you don't see the systemic racism in the country, you don't see the huge sort of problems. And it's very easy for the populist politician to point to Loitian's elite in Delhi, or the Washington sort of within the road that runs around Washington, and so you guys are completely out of touch. And to some extent, the elite sort of have brought it on themselves by not changing and understanding. Now, you can't change with every fad, but you at least have to accommodate different views and start thinking about how the world has changed and what that means. And that I think is important. At the same time, I think that, the new mood is that anything critical is seen as political. Look at Anthony Fauci, who the sort of expert on viruses in the US. And because he's been critical of the administration, he's now seen as political, in fact, falsely accused. I think he's a Republican, but falsely accused of being a Democrat, simply because he's critical of procedures. Now, a political expert is often critical because nothing is ideal. And so their job is to point out when things what is bad, but you're not a sycophant.
Right. You're back, Dr. Rajan. We can hear you now.
Yeah, I was just saying that you're not a sycophant, sure. And you can't be always, praising the establishment, because that's for somebody else to do.
You seem to be speaking from experience, Dr. Rajan, and we'll come to India later during our chat. I want to move now to global economics. We've all grown up, talking about a few vices. Don't print too much money, be fiscally prudent. And all these vices of the past that we've grown up with have suddenly become virtues, where we are now being told YCC, yield curve control, QE infinity, no more austerity. Explain to our students, how do you reconcile this segue from the vices to the virtues? And is this a brave new world and the new reality?
Well, what is a virtue for an industrial country may be a vice for an emerging market, and vice versa. We have to be careful. What has happened in a number of countries is that the battles of the past have changed. there are now new battles. In the 90s, it was the battle against inflation.
Right.
And maybe as a result of inflation targeting, maybe as a result of the globalization of the world and the creation of a global labor market, many industrial countries seem to have won the battle against inflation. In fact, won it too well, in the sense that now they're looking at how do we raise inflation? It's too low. And in the meantime, also, they've seen interest rates come down, real interest rates, what people call the equilibrium interest rate has also come down, the rate that keeps the economy sort of at full employment. And as a result, what they actually have is too much saving, too little growth, at least from their thinking. And emerging markets, still many of them are dealing with the problem of inflation. I mean, certainly we in India have that problem still, with inflation last month being 7.3 or 7.4%. So we're two different worlds. And it's important to recognize you're in two different worlds, that what applies there doesn't necessarily apply here, and what applies here doesn't necessarily apply there. One of the big no-nos in an inflationary world was to finance the government deficit. Many countries were doing this, and the process of disengaging the central bank from doing this, from quote unquote printing money, effectively was part of the fight against inflation. And the consequences of not doing it is that the government doesn't raise taxes, but instead taxes the population by printing money. The inflation tax is the big tax, and then you get the hyperinflations of the kind we saw in Zimbabwe. So as I said, the circumstances have changed. Therefore, the ideas have changed on what is necessary, what we have to do. The problem, of course, is that if you change too much, the battle that you thought was won becomes the battle of the future. And so you have to be careful that in stopping the fight against one sort of scourge, you don't effectively see it reemerge down the line. So in the West, clearly at this point, there's a massive room for the central banks to expand their balance sheets. It's having very little effect. People are willing to accumulate reserve holdings without any limit. And so really, it's up to the fiscal authorities to spend, and they're spending as if there's no limit. And the central banks are helping support that kind of spending. And so far, there's no inflation. I mean, there's very little inflation. I think that emerging markets can go a little way in that direction, but they're in a different world. They don't have the same kind of fiscal credibility, the same kind of aging populations, which may make their circumstances different. So different strokes for different folk. We have to be careful and not ape everything under the view that, economics has changed.
Very well put, Dr. Rajan. We'll come to the emerging markets in India in a minute. But to the point that you were talking about, is developed market inflation really dead? Or is there a possibility it actually comes back 3, 5, 10 years later with a vengeance? Are we playing with fire here?
Well, I think vengeance is saying it too strongly. But I do think that everything we're doing now suggests the environment in 3-4 years will be quite different from the environment that we saw post-global financial crisis. One of the things we're doing is piling up high levels of debt.
Right.
High levels of debt have, and I don't want to go into the details, but there's something called the fiscal theory of the price level, which, at some level is quite plausible. It says that, at some point when you have a huge number of liabilities from the government, essentially the public is going to price those liabilities based on government revenues going into the future. And given that government revenues in the future are fixed, then if you issue more liabilities, essentially what you do is create more inflation. And the question is, at what point do governments reach that point where they've issued so many liabilities? I mean, at one extreme is Zimbabwe, which printed money to finance its spending, or Venezuela, which is doing that, in which case the currency loses value every day, right? So there is a question of, we know this happens at some point. The question is, what point does it happen at? And with low interest rates, with reasonable government credibility, maybe you can go to 150, 200% of GDP in terms of government liabilities. Japan has shown us that's possible. But how much more? And at what point do people start saying, well, ultimately the only way out of this is for the government to inflate, and therefore inflation starts picking up? Now, I think we are some distance from that. But I do think the willingness of central banks to accommodate all this, and now many of them are changing the inflation target and saying we're willing to accommodate much higher inflation. So all this is the point I was trying to make, that we're fighting the last war, the war against disinflation, at a time when almost everything we're doing is creating an inflationary environment. Even take the push for greater equality, which I think is a good thing, but it does mean higher minimum wages, higher unit labor costs, etc. in these industrial countries. All those are going to create a more inflationary environment. Again, it's easy to dismiss all this saying, oh, there's no chance of hyperinflation. Yeah, there's no chance of hyperinflation, but somewhat higher inflation, possibly. After we are, the initial pandemic effect is disinflation because demand has collapsed. But as it comes back, maybe 2-3 years down the line, we may have a different problem.
So last question on this section, Dr. Rajan. Given what we discussed in geopolitics and economics, 2005, you kind of foresaw what could happen in terms of the global financial crisis. Do you see any fault lines developing right now which cause you worry, which crease your brows and say, this is the next big thing which is going to happen?
Well, the pandemic is big enough, right? I mean, it's people keep saying this is a once in a lifetime event. And for the young people watching, I mean, I can assure you, we've never seen anything as bad, economically speaking. The kind of damage it is doing to economies over and above the loss in growth is something we have never seen in our lifetimes. It's worse than the global financial crisis, which was focused on the financial sector. This is wider. So I do think this is terrible in its own way. And you can't look at the stock markets to see how bad this is. You have to look at what's happening, to small and medium firms, to households, to people's hopes of a better future. And so I think this is bad. I think how we come together after this is going to be very important. And, next 5 to 10 years, the effects of the pandemic will still be with us, certainly in many emerging markets, but even industrial countries. After all, the debt, you take 20-30% more of GDP in debt, it's future generations that are going to pay it down, not the current one, because it's too big to pay down within a few years. So I think this itself is big enough. But what this also raises is the possibility. We've had two once-in-a-lifetime events in 10 years. How many more once-in-a-lifetime events await us? Remember, we haven't had conflict. We haven't had big conflict. And there was a generation which went through two world wars within, they fought the first one and they were parents in the second one. And those were huge events. So I would say, yeah, cross fingers, but let us hope that this is the last one. I mean, this clearly creates a whole new environment in terms of, excessive levels of leverage, the inability to, it's exacerbated every fault line that existed before. And so we really have to think about how we resolve it.
So now we come to India, Dr. Rajan, our own lovely country. Given what you've described to us about the world, before we come to our own domestic issues, how is the global context looking for us? Is it favorable, unfavorable, on balance? How do you make it? Is this an opportunity for us or a threat?
Well, I mean, the pandemic is a problem for every country. On net, we're not going to do better than we did earlier as a result of the pandemic. I think you could think of some silver linings, despite the terrible loss of life, the terrible hardships people have been subject to as a result of the pandemic. One possible silver lining is that we decide that it's high time we reformed in ways that both enhance growth but also enhance the quality of institutions like the medical establishment that faces our people. And if that is an outcome of the pandemic, we've seen some movement, for example, on um, labor issues as well as agriculture. Again, we can debate how much those are going to take us forward. I hope they are, but certainly, if this propels a greater desire to create growth-enhancing reforms, I think that's a silver lining. Second, I mean, I do think that we have seen some external threats in the last few months emerging. And I have no doubt those external threats are not unconnected to the fact that our economic situation has become more dire over the last, 5, 10 years. And we were once, feted as a competitor to China, as an entity that would provide demand where China sort of left off. And now, if you talk to anybody amongst the investor population outside India, that glamour associated with India has faded. But again, I think external events have the ability to make us sort of look at our true selves rather than a sort of imagery that we make for ourselves, and recognize how relatively badly we have done. We're, nobody should sneer at the 7% growth over 25 years we've created, but in a sense, we need to do more given our young population, given the aspirations of people coming into the labor force, and given the fact that we have a very dominant, powerful enemy, I shouldn't say enemy, neighbor to the north. And so we need to do better. And I think that the events of the last few months, as well as the pandemic, should make us more aware of where we need to improve. And if it does that, I think it would be a salutary sort of a silver lining.
So we will go into the reforms. We will talk about the opportunities for India going ahead. But before that, if you can give us your bird's eye view prognosis of the context India is in, and if you can talk about the opportunities and threats very broadly going forward. So where are we right now, and what do you see as the way forward for us?
Well, I want to be careful talking about where we are right now because I don't think we really know. What we had is a fairly significant hit to growth from the various measures that have been put in place, and I don't want to second guess those measures. What is important to realize is that the growth hit has been significant, but as much as important as the growth hit, or even more important, are the consequences of that slowdown on the economic system itself. If a number of firms have shut down, never to reopen again, the supply side of the economy is affected. If a number of households have stopped sending their kids to school because they can't afford to do so, that again inhibits our growth potential for the future because these are going to be poorly educated kids who are going to be capable of much less quality jobs. And so in that sense, I think it's important to recognize that it's not just about the growth this year. I mean, a lot of people are fixated on that. It's about, has the economic body been hit in a way that impairs growth into the future? And what can we do to mitigate that? I think this is the question that countries like India, Mexico, Peru, which have had both a pretty severe pandemic, but also haven't been able to provide relief in the same way as some of the industrial countries. Put those together, and it creates a deeper problem. We should be aware of that, and we should be thinking about how we come out of this in a way to remedy some of those issues. Now, again, I said we don't know because some people argue our big firms are okay, our small and medium firms never really relied a lot on outside capital, and they'll bounce back. Well, I don't know. Let's wait and see. I do think that past hits to the small and medium firms have resulted in significant sort of effects over the medium term. And when we see that happen, we say, why did this happen? Why have we slowed in growth? Well, remember, we took that hit way back. And it's only now that our statistics recognize that, because those firms just disappeared, and we catch up only later. That's what I'm worried about, that our statistics will catch up only later. In the meantime, the damage may be done. What that means is we have to be dynamic. We have to do a lot now in order to offset that. If we have fewer resources, we have to use them more cleverly. But we also have to create an environment where we try and bring in foreign resources to invest. We also create more opportunities, both domestically and internationally, for us to produce and export. So these are all things that we need to have a very strong sense of, and we should be working 24/7 to make this happen. Otherwise, things look bleak.
Excellent points, Dr. Rajan. We don't know the state of industry, etc. And you're right about us having to produce a lot more jobs, output, productivity, exports. Dr. Arvind Subramaniam has written this fantastic paper on exports as well. But I want to ask a broader question. This problem that we've had about not being able to create jobs, output, productivity is for the last decade and more than a decade and a half, right? Some of the metrics that we have on our demographics is quite appalling. 17% of our GDP is from women, just 17%. Our labor force participation is quite low. Even now, 44% of our workforce is engaged in agriculture. So, public services, healthcare, you've seen that paper from Dr. Rakesh Mohan. Why is it that India is missing out like this over decades? It's not a 5-year, 10-year problem. It's a decadal problem. What have we missed out on, and why is it that jobs productivity is so difficult?
Well, I keep saying this, and I'm not sure people sort of fully appreciate that. We had a whole set of reforms in the 90s, and that was carried on by Mr. Vajpayee's government till 2004. And then, since then, till this recent sort of labor and agri efforts, there's been a lot more focus on redistribution, because we had very strong years of growth, but also much less of a consensus on what needs to be done on the growth front. I'm not saying nothing was done. I mean, you can always pick out things, specific changes, etc. But the kind of opening up of liberalization, of enhancing the entrepreneurial spirit, which was quite important, I think sort of slowed down. And UPA 1 did a lot to expand infrastructural investment, but with the global financial crisis, as well as some of the scandals that hit, essentially that infrastructure investment became quite problematic. And since then, investment has died down in many places, including infrastructure, which is so important. And so no really growth enhancing reforms to energize the private sector to become a much more sort of outward oriented entity. Infrastructure slowing down significantly, credit being hit by bad loans and so on. We've had a virtual storm. And what this requires is single-minded dedication to cleaning the debris, to making sure we can stand up again. And every time we say, okay, we're starting to make efforts, we get hit by something else. The pandemic was the latest. But I think there is no reason to doubt that good policy can take us out. I'm always very hopeful. I'm bullish about India over the medium term, but I think we need to take the right actions, and those have to be very focused on identifying the ailments and fixing them.
Perfect, sir. And you mentioned that after Vajpayee's time, we are finally seeing some reforms coming through. So we've seen some courageous reform, labor reform. We've seen some, production-linked incentives to try and get in global supply chains. We've seen tax reforms last year. Now we're seeing agri reforms again, which are courageous. Are these good starts? Are these enough? What more do you think we need to be doing from here?
I think any sort of reforms built on an identification of the real problems are good. I do think they have to be fine-tuned as you go along. Often you have this wonderful sounding reform, and then you have one clause which vitiates it all. As the one bureaucrat put it, the sting of the scorpion. The bureaucracy fights back and puts in something which makes it have, again, that control, even though the rest of the reform looks like a liberalizing reform. So I think we should monitor these very carefully. I also think it's important to build consensus that, we've spent many years without doing these reforms. People, critics, opposition parties have some ideas. And if you could build more consensus in them, you make sure they're rolled out in a more effective way. So I'm not saying one needs to debate forever, but it's important, in a democracy to build that consensus. And it would have been good if these were rolled out with that appropriate level of consensus. On what needs to be done next, I mean, certainly one big impediment to infrastructure is really the land acquisition process. And, that requires some technical changes, which is, better land mapping, clearer land ownership, etc. Some states have moved ahead on this. We need to move ahead across the board on this. And that is really a technical exercise. Of course, it has some political aspects to it. But coupled with that, there has to be a way that in situations where there are holdouts on land acquisition. I mean, in a sense, much of land acquisition should be private, between two parties, negotiated, etc., in full transparency. And that is why I say mapping the land, ensuring that people have good title so that they can sell when they want. That makes a lot of sense. But I think the second part of that is that, where there are holdouts, we make it easier for a fair process to take place, where you acquire the land but pay a fair amount, maybe even give the, some states have given some portion of the land that was acquired but developed back to the original sort of owner. Some have a process by which they have equity. But we must have a bill which recognizes the limitations of our bureaucracy and doesn't pose, a huge amount of weight on them in terms of the process, which then vitiates the process, makes it corrupt, makes it ineffective, and eventually pleases neither the buyer nor the seller. So this, I think, land acquisition would be a major change. It is difficult. I mean, let me not minimize the difficulty of acquiring land in a democracy. Industrial countries find it very hard because there are strong NIMBY movements. You're not going to run that highway through my backyard. But in India, where people would benefit from the jobs that are created, there may be ways in which they could be persuaded, certainly with some part of the shared prosperity. But that I would think is really important, especially for infrastructure build out. Fixing the financial system is another one. I mean, it's pathetic at 50% credit to GDP. We still don't have a healthy financial system. We are failing both in quantity as well as in quality. And I think, taking a close look at what's gone wrong and how we improve it. We've got, many reports from various authorities over time. I think we've had enough reports, but we actually need to have a steady process of reforming the financial sector. And I would say that at this point, limiting the role of the government in an effective way. I mean, the government is big and ultimately is the backup to everything. And that makes the financial system also a way of fiscal transfers. We can't make that continue because it's a very distorted fiscal transfer to the better connected to the middle class rather than to the poor. We need to make it a growth enhancing mechanism. And there are lots of ideas, but I would put these two as really big over and above what's been done.
And your recent paper with Dr. Viral Acharya on the financial sector, I think covers a lot of this. I particularly like the part about if DFS closes down, we'll probably be better off.
I mean, it's just a metric to catch people's attention as to what the central issue is, and the central issue is really not so much. I mean, our public sector banks are full of really good people, but it's the way we've sort of dealt with them. And in the past, I was of the view that we could reform that process, and I think we can, but I think some of the answer is to really distance these banks from the government.
Right. On the land acquisition parts, absolutely valid point. By the way, there's a promise of a single window clearance sometime in April. So seeing is believing, of course, but fingers crossed that something good comes out there as well. I want to talk about something that you mentioned in respect of both land acquisition as well as fixing the financial system, which is the bureaucracy. Is the bureaucracy a central problem to us being able to move ahead on reforms? Is too much of it on the table of the bureaucrats and not enough in terms of, I don't know, political leadership and empowered experts leading the reform process?
I think that if you look at the size of the bureaucracy, it's actually quite small relative to the bureaucracy in industrial countries.
Right.
But if you look at their power in terms of the rules and regulations that we've put in every part of the economy, we have that, we see that what they're required to do relative to what their capacity to do is night and day. And as a result, given that what they're required to do is so much more, and they simply don't have the capacity, we have all kinds of shortcuts, all kinds of places. I mean, think about zoning, to keep the nature of a city sort of environmentally friendly, but also not susceptible to disaster. We know what happened in Chennai when there were floods, right? All the water absorbing land had been paved over with concrete. Same with Srinagar. Look at a place like Simla. There are plenty of zoning laws. You can't build here, you can't build there. But just look at those hillsides, completely covered with densely packed inhabitation. You can't believe this met any zoning requirement, and you worry if there's any kind of a landslide or a flood, or a downpour, or even an earthquake. What kind of damage could be done there? So we have laws in the book. We have a bureaucracy meant to enforce it, but it doesn't really have the capacity. There's a different kind of capacity in terms of capabilities. And we sort of assume that you've been through the IAS, you're now 55, and now you understand everything that needs to be understood about a modern economy. And the reality is you understand the village economy very well, but sometimes, and again, there are a variety of really smart people in the bureaucracy, but you don't have a macroeconomic view. It would be good to have sort of experts to help you, but often the experts also have come through the bureaucracy and haven't really, the government has recognized the need to bring in outside experts on many issues, environment, economics, etc. But their ability to assimilate and to actually be in important positions is really very difficult because they tend to be seen as foreign bodies. This was different in the 80s. There was a lot more respect for these outside players like Birmal Jalan, Rakesh Mohan came in, and there were very good officers also who had experience, Y.V. Reddy, for example, or Dr. Subbarao. So I think that we need to think about what we're missing at that level. But ultimately, I would say that there is also a fear of acting today, and that needs to be addressed because of all these,
3C.
corruption, and we've removed that statute. I understand, which basically said, if something happens as a result of your action, even if that wasn't intended, you will be held liable. Now, I think we've removed that, but still there is a fear. I mean, look at, I mentioned this because I think Mr. Shori, Arun Shori, privatization minister under Vajpayee, there's a court case against him, for a privatization done 20 years ago. So, I mean, if this happens to somebody who's an upstanding figure like Mr. Shori, what is the ordinary bureaucrat who doesn't have that protection? I do hope that there's a coal secretary who was the only one to fall in the coal scandals to be imprisoned, and I don't know what happened to him. I do hope that as I understand, that justice in the longer run prevails for him.
No, excellent point, sir. I'm going to go to a totally different area now. You mentioned infrastructure, healthcare, investments required there. Should the government spend a lot more than it is doing right now? And given that we're already probably going to hit 90% debt to GDP pretty soon, and how do we fund ourselves? Is there a creative way we can fund ourselves which causes minimal pain?
So here's the problem, right? That if you don't spend, saying we need to respect the fiscal deficit, etc., and in that process, the economy atrophies. I'm not talking about demand. Everybody keeps confusing this with demand. But if your small and medium firm cannot open anymore because it has no working capital, because it has big debts, that's a loss to the economy. And it takes some years to make it up. Yes, large firms will eventually occupy that space, but we have a more concentrated economy, a less competitive one, but also one which takes some time to get back to that place. So I think it's important for people in policy to understand what kind of damage is being done. And that means getting out, talking to manufacturers, talking to smaller, and not the guys who come and praise you all the time and say, the budget is 120% out of 120 out of 100. Talk to real people on the ground, send officers if you can't go yourself because you'll be recognized, and find out how bad the situation really is. And if there's no damage, well and good. But if there's damage, you have to repair it now. You can't sort of wait and hope, because that damage will take out that part of the economy and prevent it from coming back. And that will disrupt supply chains, they will disrupt demand, so lots of concerns. I think we need to, I think it's good to keep an eye on the overall spending and to be careful. This is not a time to have a free checkbook, but targeted spending can repay a lot if it's done wisely, carefully. And, to some extent, you also have to ask the question, what is the value of keeping it at 13% rather than 15 or 17%? If a few percentage points of GDP can make a big difference in the longer term growth rate, then you've, in a sense, earned back the investment. Think of this as an investment, as necessary investment. Targeted, but if targeted, it can actually repay a lot. Now, there's a separate call for stimulus, and we have to see as the demand comes back if there's a need for that. But repair or relief, I think, is also very important. Now, if you can't do that, also think about ways you can effectively give relief by restructuring the debt loads of some of these companies, enhancing the flow of credit to them. Those are things you should be thinking about, which means two-pronged. On the one hand, get those structures to provide relief, the restructuring, the debt recovery tribunals, the bank restructuring bodies, etc. Get them, going and make them work harder. Don't sort of close down the bankruptcy court. Let it function 24/7. And in the meantime, I think also think about the financial sector, because we need more credit. How do we get the financial sectors to start offering credit when it has loan losses coming on its books? That's the second big question that has to be tackled right now.
Oh, absolutely. So if I hear you right, at least for sustaining and making sure the system doesn't collapse, spend as much as is required in a targeted fashion. And then, of course, if stimulus is required, infrastructure, etc. That is that.
Yeah, and part of that spending, before we leave this, it has to be making sure your banks are adequately capitalized so they can actually lend.
So I guess capital infusion as well as reform to make sure that we don't repeat the cycle all over again.
Right.
Two questions coming out of this. One is, will rating agencies be kind to us if we, because it feels like New Delhi is very worried about what rating agencies will think. And the second part is, you mentioned about EM being very different from DM when it comes to economics. Are we running an inflation risk? M1 is growing at 19%, M3 is growing at something like 13%. Are we running an inflation risk 6 months, 9 months down the road?
Yeah, I mean, on both questions, I mean, certainly we have to ask what are the costs of a rating downgrade. We can't be wedded to a rating based merely on what those rating agencies think. I'm not somebody who dismisses them as people who don't know. They're smart professionals, and they are going to look at longer term. And to the extent I've always advocated, we need policies that reassure investors because they're reflecting the views of investors. For example, adopting the fiscal commission that the fiscal body that the 14th Finance Commission talked about, which will be a watchdog to make sure our budget is transparent and works as advertised. Part of the problem why we are in this strait is precisely because we overspent in good times. We were very good on redistributing money we did not have. And as a result, when the emergency hit, we had no money. So the government should be asked, why aren't you prepared for this? Why do you have no money now? Precisely because our accounting acted as if we had money, but we had no money. And so, we need to prevent that. And one way to reassure the rating agencies is really to build in those medium-term constraints. This Finance Commission, the 15th, has been talking about some kind of debt target. Well, let's have a realistic debt target, but have a path to bring down the debt, because we're going to emerge from this even with the most optimistic projections with 90% of GDP as debt. And so to bring it down, we do need to have a path, a glide path, like we had for the inflation targeting. But let that fiscal commission sort of opine on that path and give us some confidence. There are ways, therefore, you can expand the resource envelope by putting constraints on yourself down the line. But this is a time to expand that resource envelope because we do need resources. And so I would very firmly say, let us do what is needed, again, on the spending, but create structures. Now, what's the worst that can happen if the rating agencies downgrade us, where it means that we haven't been convincing enough? But it doesn't necessarily mean overnight we face a disaster, because certainly on the external front, our problem right now is money coming in rather than money going out. Now, that could turn, and let's not be overconfident on that. But I would say we have some space. So, we can afford, if it is really to generate longer term growth, because if we are doing the right thing, they'll come around and they will see that this makes sense in the longer run.
What about inflation, Dr. Rajan? And a segue to that, at the moment, we're taking the stance that despite inflation being 7.34% the last print, we are still staying accommodative. We are saying we will, give growth the chance rather than inflation. Does that make sense? And do you see an inflation risk at all?
I think the inflation is probably sort of on the higher side now, certainly relative to the how much of that is temporary, how much of that is more longer term is hard to understand, which is why I think the Reserve Bank is in wait and watch mode. Now, I don't want to opine on future RBI policy. I do want to say that it's already very accommodative. People sort of look at the repo rate and say, oh, the repo rate is at thus and such. But really, what is the operative rate? It is the reverse repo rate, because there's so much liquidity in the system. So that is the rate at which the marginal cost of funds is playing out. And if it's, I'm going to guess 3.5, 3.25 or whatever it is.
Overnight repo is 3.25 is where
3.25. That compared to an inflation rate of 7 is saying that the real rate is -4. That's as accommodative as you can get across the world. I mean, this is more accommodative than many, many, many central banks. So I wouldn't be, drumming at this point and saying RBI is too tight. I would instead, let them do their job and say, they have a difficult job balancing these various interests. Growth is very slow, but inflation is also picking up, and they need to figure out how much they can do.
Actually, I'm asking you a reverse question, Dr. Rajan. Is RBI being too loose? Because after all, we do have an MPC framework which says 2 to 6%. As you said, I remember you talking about 1.5 to 2% real interest rates, and now by some measures we are -4.
I would not opine on that. I would let them do their job. Fair and, they have a monetary policy committee which will figure this out.
Absolutely fair. So I have 5 minutes left with you. I have 2 sets of questions. One is on your views around Atmanirbhar Bharat. Do you think it's the right strategy, or does it worry you as being protectionism? And then I'll come to the second question after that.
I don't know. I don't know what it is. So it's a little bit like Make in India also. I thought, and I was treating it as improving the manufacturing environment in India, the environment for doing business. And I thought that was a great idea. I didn't see why it should be at that point, given the closing of the international economy, why it should be necessarily focused only on exports. It could also be focused on, producing for the large internal market. But doing both, it seemed to me in the longer run was what our objective was. And really it wasn't, let's create the environment and then let our businesses, which are very good, do what they have to do. I think on Atmanirbhar, again, it seems to me that I want to believe it's a variation of the same theme of creating an environment. If the focus is on import substitution by erecting tariffs, which we've done a lot of in the last couple of years, then I think it's a direction we've tried before and it has failed. So I would caution against going in that direction because, ultimately people don't understand this, but in order to export, you have to be able to import as cheaply as you can the things that go into the exports. There are lots of imported elements which go into the exports. China's rise as an export superpower came on the backs of assembly. It brought in the stuff, put it together and exported it out. And similarly, you talked about production-linked incentives. In a sense, that's been successful because you've reduced the tariffs on the stuff they're importing so that you can put it together and export. And so I would be more open on in order to export, we have to be able to import. Don't erect huge tariffs and focus on creating a better environment for production in India, and then let the rest take care of itself. And that environment for production could also include services, because we now can export services much more easily. So I keep saying we have to be confident about India. And when we are confident about India, we're more willing to be liberal with India. And I think liberal, trusting the Indians to get it right, is really what will take us forward. Not constantly being suspicious of our business people, constantly being suspicious of our ability to compete. That never worked out in the past.
Last question for you, Dr. Rajan. A lot of economists, present company included, I'm not an economist, but whatever I write, we keep talking about macroeconomics not looking great, India being in some amount of trouble. Does it really matter? Markets at all-time highs, as you mentioned, FX, a lot of flows coming in, stock market close to 12,000 on Nifty. And from a politics perspective, a lot of us said demonetization was a bad idea. It didn't make a difference as far as the political context was concerned and popularity of Prime Minister Modi was concerned. Does economics really matter for when the rubber hits the ground on markets and politics?
Well, I think ultimately the reality will catch up if the reality doesn't match the image. We've talked for a long time about the need for jobs for our young people. If you aren't growing, you aren't creating jobs. Before the pandemic, we were already worried about the slow pace of job creation. Young people without jobs can, be diverted into this and that for a little while, but eventually they get angry and they come on the street. I think we have to be very careful that we're doing the right thing by our young people, creating a future for them, and that if we don't do that, we will pay the price at some point. We can use social media, we can use fake news to divert, but that has its limits, and eventually, when it fails, things could be much worse. So I would say, from a national perspective, from a patriotic perspective, from a long-run perspective, the way, we have to generate the growth that allows us to redistribute. And we need both. We need stronger systems, healthcare, education, but we also need that growth. And that's why I keep saying we need the reforms. And I'm an equal opportunity critic. I criticize all governments, which is what an academic is supposed to do.
Absolutely. I wish I could continue forever, Dr. Rajan, but it's past 7:30 now. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Rajan. Any closing comments for the students of SPJIMR and the students of the country? And we'll stop.
It's all I'll say is it is certainly a difficult time for all of you. I mean, college is one of the most exciting times of your life. I mean, I certainly remember my college with great fondness. And it's unfortunate that you have been deprived of it. You have to either work at a distance, or some of you unfortunately can't even attend college because it is closed. I am hopeful that things will turn around, certainly sometime next year, but also hopeful that you in this time find new ways of engaging with each other, but also realize how important the kinds of relationships you have built in the past are, and how much you will strive to build them in the future. So, hopefully, and this always is true, things change, things will turn out better over time, but good luck in the time to come. And, try and make use of all the new opportunities that this kind of environment creates, including this kind, of discussion we've had. I've enjoyed many seminars, which I would never have been able to attend because they were never online. And so there are some silver linings in every calamity. But again, stay safe, stay well, and I hope your loved ones are all okay. Thank you.
That's a lovely ending, sir. I can't do better. So thank you again, Dr. Rajan. And thank you everybody for dialing in, and look forward to seeing you again for one more session with SPJIMR CFS. Thank you, Dr. Rajan. Pleasure.
Bye.
Bye.